Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. It's good to be with you. Thanks for joining us. President Trump says he is preparing to release an executive order related to the use of force by law enforcement. In an interview with Fox News, Mr. Trump said he supports ending the use of chokeholds by police officers, but that it also depends on the situation. During a roundtable discussion with law enforcement and community leaders in Texas Thursday, the president appeared to change his tone on how police should respond to protests nationwide. Skylar Henry is at the White House with the latest.
We are looking for ways to advance better standards, better training.
Vice President Mike Pence held a raw discussion on race and police reform with African-American faith leaders in Pittsburgh.
I'm tired that people still do not acknowledge that systemic racism is real.
White lives matter, and we don't deny that. But right now, white lives aren't being oppressed in the same way.
The conversation comes a day after President Trump promised to take action on police reform.
We're working to finalize an executive order that will encourage police departments nationwide to meet the most current professional standards of force. And that means force, but force with compassion.
Local officials in some cities have already begun to enact reforms. Congressional Democrats introduced their police reform bill earlier this week, and Senate Republicans are expected to unveil their proposals early next week. President Trump plans to return to the campaign trail next Friday and is pushing back against criticism. The date June 19th, known as Juneteenth, celebrates the end of slavery in the U.S. There's also controversy on the choice of venue, Tulsa, Oklahoma, the site of a race massacre that resulted in the deaths of hundreds of African-American residents nearly 100 years ago.
Was that on purpose?
No, we're going to Oklahoma. And if you think about it, relative to your question, think about it as a celebration.
In the nation's capital this weekend, protesters are expected back on the streets for more demonstrations against police violence.
Major Garrett, Catherine Herridge, and Marquise Francis join me now. Major is CBS News Chief Washington Correspondent. Catherine is CBS News Senior Investigative Correspondent. And Marquise is a national reporter and producer for Yahoo News. Welcome, everyone. Major, I want to start with you. We heard in Skylar's piece the president had initially said that he wanted law enforcement to, quote unquote, dominate protesters. But now he says he wants them to dominate with compassion. What exactly does that mean? What's behind that change?
Well, this is a classic example, Elaine, of it sounding as if the president is changing, but he's really not. People say, oh, he said dominate with compassion. No, what he actually said was it's compassionate to dominate because we're protecting businesses, we're saving lives. Essentially equating all protesters with those who might wage violence, threaten lives, and threaten businesses. Essentially blurring all differences between those who protest peacefully and assemble peacefully with those who commit acts of violence. So this is a classic illustration of how the president makes it sound as if he's softening his tone, but if you look at the underlying logic, he's not softening his tone at all. And to the point of that piece, the president talking about an executive order to encourage police. Well, let me talk about those two E's. Executive order, E number 1, and encourage, E number 2. Both in the context of this national debate are as slow-moving and as cautious as you can go. Executive orders, as we have learned through the Obama administration and the Trump administration, can be reversed. They're not law. They don't engage Congress. Also, encourage, that means you're asking police departments to do what? Use the current standards. Well, if I understand this debate in the country about policing right now, it's not about encouraging the application of current standards. It's about evaluating and quite possibly changing current standards of policing. So you have the president saying compassion, but what he really means is rioters and protesters are effectively the same, and encouraging police to keep the status quo. That doesn't strike me as anywhere close to the epicenter of this actual national debate about policing, race, and justice.
Some really important context, Major. Marquise, let's talk about legislation then, because both the House and Senate have been working on their own versions of police reform legislation. Where do things currently stand with both of those proposals?
Yeah, so the Democrats presented what they're calling the Justice and Policing Act,
which outlines basically the most transformative vision of policing in America, as Representative Karen Bass stated. And this legislation includes curtailing protections that shield police officers accused of misconduct from being prosecuted, creating a national registry for tracking police misconduct, and requiring reporting of data on the use of force. And we've seen this actually work in cities like Camden, New Jersey, where in 2013, they disbanded the local police department. And then later, what they did was they reconstituted it as a county agency. And I talked to the current chief of police a couple weeks ago, and he mentioned that in 2014, they had 65 complaints of excessive use. In 2018 and in 2019, it was down to 3. So we know that this can work. And then there's other provisions in that bill, such as some federal requiring police officers to not only have a body camera, but use it. So this is what the Democrats' plan is. Republicans, we're still waiting on what they have. We're expecting this to be presented on the House on July 4th. But we know that a new Reuters poll this week says that the majority of Americans want reform. Exactly 82% of Americans want a ban on police chokeholds. We actually saw at least 11 cities as of this week have banned it, including New York City, where Eric Garner died by use of a chokehold. So we're seeing now Democrats and Republicans kind of go back and forth with wording on what things are. The big thing from the Democratic, what they presented was that they do not want to defund or disband the police. And that's been a big source of conversation this week. And that's one thing that they made very clear. So now it's just a back and forth and what we've seen over time in Congress, but we're waiting to see what the Republicans are putting forth.
I want to turn to some other news in Washington for the moment. Catherine, the D.C. Court of Appeals heard arguments Friday in the case of President Trump's former national security advisor, Michael Flynn. What are your takeaways from that hearing?
Well, Lane, the hearing lasted for 2 hours, and there was really so many extraordinary elements about it. There were 3 parties that were represented, the Flynn defense team, the government, and then a lawyer was representing the federal judge in this case, Emmett Sullivan. And based on the line of questioning from the 3 justices, it does appear that they will allow a hearing to go forward in mid-July that has been said by Judge Sullivan, where he's appointed a third party to argue against the government's motion to dismiss. You remember last month, the Justice Department moved to dismiss the case against the former National Security Advisor Mike Flynn on the basis they said they found new evidence, and they also felt the FBI had left open the case simply to lay a perjury trap for Flynn. His lawyer argued that the government alone or the executive branch has the ability to bring prosecutions, and the government has effectively called time on this case, and she said it was time to leave the field. But based again on the line of questioning from at least 2 of the justices, they want to see this process play out just a little bit further before they would take the extraordinary step of intervening in the decision.
Well, Catherine, what are some of the political consequences potentially of this case dragging out?
Well, I think, again, it's going to come all down to the timing. We have the hearing that now looks like it will proceed in mid-July. If in that hearing, Judge Sullivan moves against the motion to dismiss, the scenario which is likely, and it was discussed today in the oral arguments, is that the government and the defense would come back to the appeals court, so the same court that was hearing it today, and would argue that they should force the dismissal of the lower court for it to be abandoned in total. But it also raises the specter of it going into September and October, so it clashes right up against the election cycle. And I think that that can cut both ways here. I think for the president and his supporters, the Flynn case has really been a rallying cry, what they see as an abuse by the FBI and the Justice Department, and what they believe was the unfair targeting of the Trump campaign. But for the detractors and critics of the president, they see this as yet another example of an abuse of power, in this case with the Attorney General, they say, who did the bidding of the president.
Also, Catherine, earlier this week, the Director of National Intelligence declassified additional documents which were part of an intelligence community assessment into Russian election interference. What more can you tell us about that?
Well, this is called Annex A, and it was attached to the original 2016 Russian election interference report that was done by the U.S. intelligence community. And up until this week, it has been highly classified. The declassification reveals, I think what was really widely known at this point is that the intelligence community felt that the information contained in the so-called Steele dossier, this was the opposition research from 2016, just didn't meet the threshold to be included in the body of this intelligence community report. So it was put into this annex, which clearly says that it was minimally corroborated. But I think the problem here for the FBI and the Justice Department at that time is that they used that information, which was not good enough for the intelligence community, but they used it 3 times more to obtain surveillance warrants for a Trump campaign aide. And it shows that kind of disconnect with the handling of this information.
Speaking of elections here, Marquise, the president is facing criticism over the date and location of his first campaign rally since the coronavirus outbreak began, as well as the date and location of the newly announced Republican National Convention. Remind us of the significance in both of these cases.
Yeah, absolutely. So as Skylar mentioned earlier, Juneteenth is the oldest nationally celebrated commemoration of the ending of slavery in the U.S. Dating back to 1865, that's when Union soldiers returned back to Galveston, Texas, and that's when they realized slavery was over. And in actuality, President Abraham Lincoln, the former President Abraham Lincoln, had ended slavery 2.5 years before. So Juneteenth is a huge day for the country and a huge day for Black America. And we're seeing right now with the uptick in corporations responding to a lot of the things happening. You're seeing companies like Twitter, Nike, Adidas. This is now becoming a federally mandated holiday for these companies, so it's a big day. And then the fact that it's in Tulsa, Oklahoma, this was the site of Black Wall Street, one of the most successful Black, communities at the time. 99 years ago, a white mob came in and destroyed basically the entire community. And this includes 300 Black-owned businesses, 2 theaters. They had pharmacists. They had a pilot with his own private airplane. So for a lot of people, it's really kind of a slap in the face. And a New York Times op-ed today stated it's kind of Trump's racist trolling again. I heard in a soundbite earlier, he said, it's a celebration. And I would question who's that celebration exactly for. We know the RNC previously was supposed to be held in North Carolina, and that's no longer happening. So he had to find another venue. And we're seeing that also play out in the future as well.
Major, how should we understand this choice of dates and locations? Does it suggest anything at all about the Trump campaign's planning process here?
A couple of things. One, there is an intentional effort within the Trump campaign and the Trump presidency, this was true in 2016, to create media freak-out moments, and they would categorize this as a media freak-out moment. So, we're going to do this, and everyone freaks out and alleges all these terrible things about us, and we're just going to have, the president just says, we're just going to have a celebration. We didn't know anything. What are you guys freaking out for? Whenever there's a media freak-out, in the eyes of the Trump campaign, and certainly the president, that means his supporters are alerted, essentially. They become sensitized to that moment. And instantly, before a conversation begins to deepen about what is or isn't going on, or what is or isn't the symbolism, you have an us versus them. They're attacking the president. The media's freaking out. He has to be right. So that's built in to most of these calculations. As to whether or not that they did anything about Tulsa, Juneteenth, or Jacksonville and the history of this Axe Handle Saturday, which has other racial overtones of violence to it, probably not, in the sense that did they scrub all that and look for it and ask themselves, are there any racial sensitivities that we have to tread lightly on here? No, because that's not something that is organized within the campaign, to sort of be on the alert for that and to preemptively have a conversation about that. And then the president says, well, I'm just having a rally. It's just a celebration. Why are you getting so upset with me? I think one of the more interesting components of this, Elaine, in addition to everything that we've just discussed, is what is he doing in Oklahoma? How does that fit into any kind of re-election strategy? That's a layover state, or at least ought to be, for the president, and the surrounding media markets ought to be layover territory for the Trump campaign, confident about its reelection in Texas, Arkansas, even southern Missouri. This seems to me to be a very odd place to go when you could go to Arizona, you could go to Georgia, you could go to North Carolina, you could go to Ohio, Iowa, all places that are identified and identifiable as battleground states. The Trump campaign has spent money and is spending money in Iowa, which it won by 9 points, and Ohio, which it won by 10 points, if my memory serves. So those are sensitive places where they need to be, and from their perspective, have the Trump campaign visible and present. Oklahoma? What has that got to do with any, just take the race component out of it. I'm not trying to put it on the shelf. I'm just trying to say there's another dimension to this as well. What are you doing in Oklahoma? Isn't that safe territory politically? Maybe not. That's also telling, it strikes me.
And if we have an opportunity to ask the Trump campaign, we will certainly ask about that. But Major, all of this is happening, of course, in the middle of a pandemic, and supporters attending the president's rally next week must agree not to sue him or his campaign should they contract the coronavirus. And we should note that COVID-19 cases in Oklahoma have been increasing, according to the New York Times. So how does holding a rally at this moment square with the advice of health experts? And more broadly, how does holding a rally line up with the president's messaging when it comes to the coronavirus?
Well, the first answer is it doesn't line up with what the advice of public health officials is. It just, now is not a time for an up-close, close quarters rally of any kind, not an outdoor concert, not a sporting event, not a political event. It just doesn't line up anywhere in the country. That doesn't fit within the guidelines. Point one. Point two, how does it fit within the messaging? Well, the messaging is transition to greatness, everything is fine, don't worry. So it's roughly consistent with that if you're willing to believe it and essentially set aside the recommendations of public health officials. I will say, however, Elaine, there is something very consistent in one respect. For the last 3 weeks in Washington, at least, Republicans in a conversation about whether or not there should be a fourth economic relief bill, meaning should there be aid to the states to deal with their budget deficits as it relates to crashing revenues because of the economic lockdown as a result of the pandemic, and other issues related to economic relief, whether it's more direct payments to individual Americans or extension of unemployment benefits, the first thing they say is, well, you know, we better have some protection against reckless lawsuits, liability protection for businesses, colleges, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that hasn't happened, but the Trump campaign is achieving that at the very front end. If you want to attend a Trump rally, you have to preemptively waive all of your litigation rights, which essentially brings tort reform right into the fore. So, at least in this sense, ideologically, the Trump campaign is saying what all of the Republicans saying. You can't sue over coronavirus, period. And if you want to attend a Trump rally, you waive those rights. Just as they would like you to see those rights, if not waived, severely restricted when it comes to workplaces or any other kind of place where you might be exposed to the virus while doing your job.
So many layers to unpack with all of these events. Major Garrett, Catherine Herridge, and Marquise Francis, thanks to you all. Great to see you. Have a great weekend.